I am so excited, so happy to have two powerhouses in my virtual casita, I should say. Christina Kent and Megan Durham. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Good. I'm good. Are you
Delighted.
good?
I know.
I don't want to speak for you. Sorry.
No, so good, so good. And you are the first duo to join me on the podcast. Well, you and my daughters, I should say. I did a podcast episode with my daughters.
I love that.
Thank you again so much. I got to brag on you a little bit in the show intro, but for our listeners who are getting to hear you and see you for the first time, let's start with Christina. Just tell us a little bit about your artistic background as a singer and how that got you into what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I started in music a little bit kind of late. I was always terrified to sing and felt really like an outsider in the world of music. I was like a secretive teenager who would sing in my room but not sing for anybody else. But then kind of my desire to learn outgrew my fear. And I auditioned for this very small music program, like this kind of pre-entry program. And that led into me doing my master's in opera. So I just kind of fell into this world of like music and singing and learned about what opera was for the first time in like my 20s. Um, and from there, like when I was doing my master's, I've always loved to teach. I used to teach horseback riding when I was younger. And I decided, I think I want to do some teaching. So even in like my master's, I started working with some students and realized I loved it. And built a studio and had a studio in Vancouver, BC for a while. And then since then, it's been really my heart is working with singers. Like I love to sing for sure, but more than performing, I really love connecting with other people and supporting them in the use of their voice. So now I have a studio here in Victoria, BC and still doing the thing.
Still doing the thing. I love it. Megan, what about you?
I grew up in a very musical family. Um, I was a band, I don't want to say nerd because we're not all nerds, but yeah, I was a band geek I was a percussionist. And I guess I also came to singing. I always sort of sang, but I came to, I guess, singing in a more um, structured context in college. And yeah, I was like, oh, what do I want to major in? I don't know. Let's pick voice. And so then I did went to graduate school after that, and it was probably in graduate school where I started. I really started feeling like, wow, this is a really big world, and I'm not sure how I fit into it. And kind of like Christina, I discovered pretty early that I loved to work with people, and I sort of felt like an outsider. It always feels kind of odd to admit this, but I realized that I wasn't doing the music because of the music. I was doing the music because that's how I liked to connect with people.
Mm.
So it was more about the people, I think, than it was about really anything else. And so that was great. And at the same time, I had a lot of struggles vocally. For anyone listening, I'm a very low mezzo, and it took a really long time for my voice to really kind of settle. And I had a lot of shame around that, and I had some really wonderful, helpful mentors, and then I had some folks that were pretty destructive in that process. And I think now as a teacher, it's been my quest to really notice what those systemic issues are, knowing that most people are really, really doing the best they can with the information they have and really trying to have compassion at the same time, noticing, there's some real structural problems with how the music industry and music education is set up. And right now, where that has led me is I work a lot with folks who have injuries. So I'm a singing voice specialist as well as a trauma-informed voice teacher. So a lot of the folks that I see have experienced significant stress in their lives and in their bodies. And certainly perfectionism, our topic today, feeds a lot of that cycle.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I think this is why I was so attracted to you both. I found you both on social media and then got to partake in some of the training that you do, which was absolutely beautiful. Aligns so much with how, my philosophy as an artist as well as a teacher. And obviously, what we're doing here on this podcast as well is to have these honest conversations with performing artists who will listen to this and be like, oh, them too? This trauma informed specialist and classically trained singer, like them too. And it's really we're seeing a lot of deconstruction around this topic of perfectionism, which, I'll have people tell me, but Melissa, is perfectionism necessarily a bad thing? Like, shouldn't we strive for excellence? I think that's a noble cause, but why do we need to pay more attention to to the vernacular, right? To the semantics of why are we using this word and why is it so triggering?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can jump in with some thoughts there. I think in my own experience, you know, studying classical singing and opera, I really had this moment of realizing that I had lost my capacity to enjoy my singing or to have any sense that anything was ever complete.
Mm.
Like, I remember just being struck by, like, I think I've lost the capacity to hear beauty because there was this feeling of assumed deficiency that I had learned. And it's interesting, I think there's this really important difference. So many of us as singers learn there's always more you can do. Like there's always more in the piece, in the music that you can bring to it. And you know what? That's actually very true. There's this beautiful aspect to that of like realizing that we can discover something new, you know, in a piece of music we've worked on for ages. And I find that often that leads into like, it's never done, it's never complete, it's never good enough. And I know Thomas Curran does a lot of work on perfectionism. I think he's a great book called The Perfectionist Trap or something like that, to double check the title. But he was talking about how perfectionism is a relational trait. So it's learned in relationship
Mm.
and in environments. And I think a lot of us in, like Megan spoke to, in like studio spaces or in music programs, actually learn that we are insufficient. And we learn to be in this pattern of anticipating being called out as missing the mark. So in the workshop that we do, we often highlight Brene Brown's definition of perfectionism, which is this, summarizing her words, this idea that if I look perfect, act perfect, we could maybe add in sing perfectly, that I'll avoid the pain of shame and blame. And I really think that sadly, for a lot of us, in one way or another, we've actually have experienced shame or blame in moments of challenge in our singing. So it was a very real thing that we faced. And so therefore perfectionism, this guarding, this like, okay, I'm going to try to control everything so I look perfect and I can avoid that, becomes a source of chronic stress and separation from ourselves and our permission to be human as singers, which is very important.
I am smiling so big because I was like, this woman just basically like wrote my next social media post. Like I can't talk about
I love it.
this is why I love you guys so much because I think the whole we learn perfectionism in relationship, I have never heard that before. And yet I'm sitting here nodding my head, probably like, "Ugh," do some neck stretches after this, after nodding so hard, because I can see that's exactly how I learned it in my life. And I learned it personally. Megan, I'm going to toss the ball here to you in a second because of stressors in my life. I'm the oldest and the only female of three children. And so I just said that, and all my my well-versed people in counseling and all things therapeutic services just buzzed as well, like, that explains so much, like happy girl, mask, got to do it
Right.
perfect, got to make sure everybody's taken care of. If I'm not vigilant, everything's gonna fall apart. And I've so seen that in my art, and I've had to unlearn that. Megan, do you find this to be true in the work that you do as well?
For sure. And circling back to your initial question too, I think two threads kind of come to mind to pull. And the first is that perfectionism often begins as a survival strategy in that community that we learned in. And so is it bad? No, I think so often we think of it as not being a positive thing or being so much a positive thing that we have a hard time seeing nuance there. But certainly when our bodies perceive threat, we create all kinds of protective strategies to avoid being hurt again, which makes really beautiful biologic sense. And so for those that say, is it a problem? No, it's definitely not a problem. And I think the other thread to pull from that is that it's often very painful. And in a lot of places, I love tricks, tools. Christina and I, we use the tricks and the tools all the time. Like that's how sort of voice teaching sometimes. And I think a lot of what we're curious about is what happens when someone isn't ready to move on from the pain because the pain was never seen.
Mm.
And I think, again, if we learn it in community, it makes sense that we have to unlearn it in community. But I think part of that is being able to be witnessed in that struggle without the need for a quick fix.
Mm.
And that as a teacher is extremely difficult. Um, to all the things, oh well, I should have the right tool here, they're paying me, so all the sort of the shame spiral again, there's so many spirals happening. And so how do we then acknowledge that this could be a survival strategy, and if the body hasn't found a safer alternative yet, it really may not be ready to move on. And to make an assumption that I have a tool uh, as someone who's not inhabiting that person's body is part of the master apprentice issue in the first place. Making assumptions about how bodies move and at what pace bodies and voices sort of quote unquote should be moving.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And I think everybody's like taking a deep breath with you right now. Just saying that, just like you said, acknowledging it. What for you personally, if you're willing to share, what was a turning point in your own life as a singer, as an artist, to move towards a space of restoration, healing, and unlearning this for yourself first as a singer? Or, you know what, let me not put caveats on that question because maybe it happened first as a teacher, then as a singer. So I don't want to I'm just curious about your journey, if there was a turning point for you.
Mm-hmm.
Either one.
Oh, okay, I'll go first. It did start as a singer, for sure. And there were kind of two pivotal moments. One was when was I was doing auditions and I was looking for my next thing to kind of level up my way to be on stage.
Don't we all?
Exactly. And I found this like online course, this like free MOOC, and the title was like mindfulness for well-being and peak performance. And for me, it was like the peak performance thing. I'm like, oh my God, that's like, maybe that's what I need. Because I was very anxious on stage. And what ended up happening was through a mindfulness and meditation practice, I actually got a little bit of awareness around how I was actually speaking to myself, my inner dialogue when I was singing. I had become I didn't realize half the time how much criticism, how much like coldness I had towards like any moment of like my vibrato being uneven or something like that. And that little moment or that bit of space of awareness really motivated me to find a better way. I was like, what is the point in actually doing this if I'm so like cruel to myself? And also, where did this come from? Mm-hmm. And then in that time as well, I'd been working, this was post-grad, like after my master's, and I was still working very intensively with some teachers that are very much in that master apprentice and just kind of teaching the way that they were taught, but there was a lot of harm in that method for me. And my body actually started to refuse to sing in the way that I was asking it to. I could no longer sustain like two measures just because of the tension in my body of just trying to brace against always feeling like a failure no matter what I did. Even though at that point my technique was, when I listened back, was probably the best it had been in some ways. My emotional body was like, we cannot sing this way.
Mhm.
And so I started this process of undoing, and we can talk more about that later because it's a practice that could be interesting for us to discuss. But I kind of on my own started to undo some of these patterns and then found community, and am still in process with that now, and I'm getting really curious about how that looks as a voice practitioner, voice teacher, how I can support other people skillfully through that.
Beautiful. What about you, Megan?
And you do. I was say,
Yes,
and
you
you do,
do.
Christina, so skillfully. Yeah, thanks for asking. So I don't know that I have like a one singular moment, but even outside of music, um, I gosh, for as long as I can remember, I feel like I struggled with not being able to separate making mistakes from being a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I mean, I remember when I was taking piano lessons, I was very young and I was really eager and I was always quote unquote very whatever good means, I was always prepared, like I could do the thing. I was a little bit of a ham. And then in this one recital, I just remember blanking and I had this feeling of, wow, people are listening to me. People are. I'm not sure if the word judging was there, but in my sort of remembering of that moment, I think my body. That was the first time that my body had this recognition that this wasn't really just for fun. This this was sort of serious, or this is for some sort of adjudication. And yeah, I mean, that I think that sort of freeze moment is has stuck with me. But I think since then, how that really manifested through undergrad and through grad school was in an effort to then be more perfect, which would correlate to safe. It felt safe to have answers. So I would seek out an expert. I would want to find the person, or kind of what Christina was saying, the training, or like the top three things, that I could take with me. So that like my perfectionism became synonymous with answer seeking. And
Mm,
I think the problem for me was I lost my ability to think critically about my own experience. And I gave up so much of my artistic and physical and emotional sovereignty to someone outside of my own experience and body. Um, and it really led to a binary patterning. And I know Christina and I talk about this a lot, where if I'm safety seeking in one area, that sort of binary, safe or unsafe, can often lead to other things like this is right or wrong, this is on pitch or off pitch,
mm.
this is moral or immoral. Like everything sort of became very black and white. And again, that's not a particularly pleasurable existence, nor is it a very human one. And so I think so much of what we are interested in offering and what I have found useful in coming back into my body through things like meditation, mindfulness, yoga, movement is both and.
Yes.
I am a terrified performer a lot of the time, and I'm an effective performer at the same time. How can I reconcile those things? Because I certainly can't cut out my autonomic nervous system. And I think that's something else too that we're curious about. Like, we're not about calm all the time because I think our industry requires activation. And so it's really more for us about learning to build a capacity and a community around these ideas rather than getting rid of it. Because I'm not sure that I don't think that's possible. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, it's like I feel like that would be the other extreme of, being robotic. Like, let me just
yeah.
get through the performance. That would be the other extreme of it, right? So
Yeah.
I find all those scary, especially if you've been functioning in
Mm-hmm.
survival mode and you're singing, like what you've both described. I hope it's also like comforting too. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so for instance, we talk so much about community, and I know this is what you facilitate in your class, in your course that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But for someone listening right now who's like, what do I do? Like, what's the first step? Is there a first step that you would encourage someone to take as they're making a shift in self acceptance, in recognizing that, okay, I've been at it for so long. Obviously, something's not working. Like you said, I may be a very effective technical singer, but I've lost the spark. What would be a first step that you could guide our listener through to get back to a place of self acceptance?
I know that Christina has a lot to say around this. I'm going to just offer one small thing and then I'm going to give it over to Christina. But and I'm saying this because I just have seen this really frequently.
Mm,
I think the first thing for a lot of folks is acknowledging the pain and making sure that before anything else happens, like, is there something that hasn't been seen that really needs to be witnessed? Because again, I think as a voice community, we don't always like to be there. We like to get to the part where everything's great and feels good and sounds awesome, which is awesome. I love that too. And I think for so many people, particularly in the master apprentice tradition, um, we don't share our pain. We don't perhaps have a safe enough environment to share that pain in. And so I think for me, that's just a useful check in. For some people, that may just be a quick question, like internal diet. For other people, that could take a while
sure.
to sit with. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Christina, what about you?
Oh, I mean, I think one thing I'll just name as I offer a few practices is it's highly personal, and it's unfolding over time.
Hmm.
So I can just share a bit of how I started,
Yeah.
which was I started this intuitive practice that then I kind of put a bit more ideas around and I offer to singers. So it's called a shoulds practice. So what I noticed when I was describing earlier, when I was so frozen in my body and like just nothing was working, um, I started to just play with doing the opposite of everything I thought I should do. So whenever I was shooting all over myself, I would I remember distinctly this moment of like deciding to actually collapse my ribs and kind of curl up and sing in a little ball. Because everything in my training, I was doing a lot of opera at that time, was like lift and expand the ribs, expand, expand, expand. And I was like, what if I collapse? Like, what if I let my body collapse and I see what that's like? And I slowly started to explore that in lots of different ways. And it gave me access to choice. I started to reconnect with my own autonomy and really the fact that I could decide for myself how I wanted to sing. I also discovered that my body could sing in lots of different, like, I didn't have to be this frozen, like I could fold up, I could lie on the ground, I could do all of these things and still sing. So it was kind of freeing in that way. And then I think another thing that was really important was self-compassion practices. And this kind of speaks to what Megan was mentioning, because Kristen Neff is a great resource if people are curious, or Christopher Germer. Two people have done kind of a lot of research around self-compassion and really spearheaded it in many ways. But there's a self-compassion break process, which is super easy for anybody to do. So say if you're singing and you're feeling like this major criticism, like it's never enough, like I'm always missing the mark. To pause in that moment and first acknowledge this is painful. Like to acknowledge your pain, like Megan was speaking to say like this hurts, and like actually choose a phrase that feels true to you. This sucks. This
Yeah.
is frustrating, right? Something that feels authentic to your voice. So you're acknowledging the hurt. And then the second is to connect to common humanity, the second step. So you're using a phrase that reminds you that you're not alone, that there's so many singers out there who actually can totally relate to the pain that you're going through. And that's not to diminish, it's just to expand and realize that you're not isolated in that experience. And then the third thing is to ask, what do I need? That's the ultimate question of self-compassion. What do I need? And maybe it might be like that you need to hear something. There might be a phrase that comes to mind. Sometimes you might ask, what do you need? And it might be really quiet and you might not know. But there's a power in actually just deciding that you're going to keep asking and you're going to create some space to listen
Mm.
instead of like, what do I need to be? What do I need to fix? Is what do I need? And that can be a really beautiful way to recalibrate how we're in relationship with ourselves. And I'll just name too that I think part of this process is asking, how are we receiving and responding to other singers? This is a big thing.
Yeah.
Our whole, especially Western culture around music, think of like America's Got Talent, for example, or anything like that, where you literally have a big red X that shows up over your head in the moment of stumbling. Like there cannot be a better representation of what it's like around that. So even that kind of idea, right? I think it's also, I think part of the process is starting to ask yourself, how do I respond to other singers' perceived weaknesses and flaws?
Mm.
And just to get curious around that, to get curious around kind of our, maybe our rush to judgment, or do we have more compassion for other people than we do for ourselves? That can be a really interesting area to reflect. And I think how we communicate about one another is a big step in actually healing ourselves.
Ooh, I hope you are taking notes. If you are listening to this on a walk or a jog, definitely pause or download for later. Go and re-listen to this over and over and over again because there were some beautiful steps that you both walked us through right there and things that I could immediately acknowledge for myself. So awesome. Thank you so much. Now, so if you're a voice professional listening to this in any way, shape, or form, I got to take this beautiful class with you both, Unlearning Perfectionism in the Voice Studio. It's one that I will continue feasting upon and coming back to. But this is something now that you've offered a few times and you're coming up with another date as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about this class, what the heart is behind it, and who it's geared for?
Yeah, go ahead, Megan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you're listening, come on, come on. It's for you. It's truly for anyone. So this next iteration is perfectionism in the voice studio, whether that's you as a teacher feeling the need to have the right answer at all times, which we honor, like we have all been there. And I will also say that everything Christina and I, if it hasn't been clear, the things that we offer them because we've struggled with them and continue to struggle with them. So I think at its core, this is a community to help support in that process of certainly unlearning, but being with the things that are difficult. Because as we've sort of had a theme, it is relational, and so our sort of anecdote, if there is one, I'm not sure, but an anecdote toward healing those wounds is being seen by other people who are going through that struggle. So I think that's really the goal, and offering practices around that. We certainly don't have answers. We've joked at times that we should market it as like we're not really sure what you're going to get out of this. We've got some questions, but we don't have answers. We don't know, but truly, I think it is a place to be in that liminal space with one another and to get curious about what comes up in a really emergent way. Christina,
Beautiful.
anything to add?
Yes, yes, please add.
Oh yeah, I just yes to all of that. Yeah, and I think like I think I kind of see there being three like very broad elements to it. Like one is first really understanding, again, to go back to what we were saying earlier, to understand the system in which a lot of us learned these things, because that can help to reduce the shame,
Mhm.
right? So kind of to make sense of like, where did this come from? And we do look in more detail at like that master apprentice lineage, especially in voice education. And that can be really, really helpful because it can feel like this personal flaw or something that's very confusing, or like, where did all of the shame and fear come from? So we kind of help to shed some light on possibilities there. And then the second is like really, I guess, a two-step process in how can we be with our own experience of perfectionism so that we can hold space for other people and their experience of
Mhm.
perfectionism, because it's the two I think have to happen we can't just be there for one another, I don't think, necessarily, if we haven't maybe done some work with ourselves. I also just think it's so fascinating. I really want to name that, like, perfectionism specifically as a voice teacher. is a real thing
Mm.
and is really quite complex, and it's woven in kind of with our singing. And I really think a lot more teachers need support and maybe feel a lot of kind of shame and anxiety around that. So we hope to really help to, really to see people in that experience and provide them with some support.
Yes. One of the biggest gifts from that experience is that whole, oh, you too? You too, not
Yeah.
only like, the second process in your, self-compassion break really is to realize that you are not alone in this. And so let's just talk about it more, right? Let's acknowledge it and let's work through it together. Megan, Christina, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to encourage our listeners. I'm going to ask you one more question before we sign off. What is something that is igniting your passion right now? This can be as deep as I've just read this work on mindfulness practices in my practice, or it can be as simple as hallelujah for the carpool line. Like, thank you. Thank you. Megan, we'll start with you first. What's something that's igniting your passion right now?
Ooh, okay. I'm gonna have to go with sort of the carpool line theme. I am, well, you know what? Okay, twofold. One, just connection. It lights me up. It nothing allows my body to feel safe enough, like creating those connections, and so that always lights me up. And we're at the beginning of summer. It's going to be Camp Mom this summer, and gardening really lights me up. I love being in the dirt. I love planting things. Sometimes they live, sometimes they die because I'm not particularly great. But it's a good practice of like, you win some, you lose some, and I can practice my perfectionistic tendencies in the dirt, and that feels really solid to me.
I love that. That is so on brand. So on brand. Christina, what about you?
Oh, it's tricky. There's a lot of really cool stuff right now. Again, Thomas Curran, I'll mention, is somebody I just discovered who's done some work on perfectionism. His work is fascinating me, so I'm doing a bit of a deep dive there. I am finding myself more and more curious about. We talk about perfectionism is learned in relationship, and I really think there is something about relationship in nature, that nature is a teacher. And that is something that I don't fully understand yet, but I know deep in my bones is true. And I think having space, something as simple as like a plant on your desk or a moment out in nature, I think if we listen and attune to it, it has a lot to teach us about creativity and who we are. And I'm also just curious, I think this might be helpful for teachers and singers out there to pause and to reflect on who am I apart from my roles in life? And what is there space, who am I when I can just be without a role as teacher or singer? And to get curious about that question.
I love it so much. If people want to connect with you, I'm going to put all this stuff in the show notes, but if they're interested in the sign up for the class, where can they go?
They can go to, so our current sign up will be on my website, which is www.respirevocalwellness.com, which is also my Instagram handle, Respire Vocal Wellness. Christina?
Yeah, and if you follow us on the old, I love the chess.
If you're watching this on YouTube, you are getting all the theatrics, the way we
very silly.
toss it over.
Yeah, honestly, I think probably the old Insta is probably the best because you can go to the link in our bio, you see all the details. We do most of our kind of, posts on the workshop there. So if you're kind of wanting to get a bit more of a sense of some of the content and all of that, that's the place to go. Oh, and that's mindfulsoundstudio.com or at Mindful Sound Studio.
Gorgeous. We'll make sure we have it all in the show notes. Thank you again, ladies. Have an awesome rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.